Well, I finally decided to build an 00 gauge layout. As you will know if you've watched any of my previous railway modelling videos, I've been modelling for some time now in British N gauge. I was interested in modelling British railway operations, specifically operations in the 1930s and especially those in the British Midlands. This was largely due to my family history. My grandfather, my dad's dad, was an engine driver. He started with the Midland Railway towards the end of the 19th century and retired as a senior driver for the London, Midland and Scottish in the 1930s. We did have some family members who continued on with the railways through nationalisation in 1948 into British Railways days, but our experiences with British Railways were not the fondest, largely tending to neglect, decay and death, and it was more towards my granddad's respect for the LMS that I looked when returning to railway modelling. Given my modelling interests, it was clear that I basically had a choice between 00 gauge and British N gauge. Well, if I'd had immense resources of space and cash, O gauge could also have been an option. I opted for British N gauge because I could really only make space in my house for a layout of tabletop proportions. N gauge offers scope for an operational layout of some complexity in a tabletop size. Realistically, 00 gauge requires the dedication of an entire room to allow for a full operational layout. So I went ahead and built my N gauge layout. To clarify the difference between the scales, here's the LMS Coronation class locomotive Duchess of Abercorn in 00 gauge and British N gauge. A heck of a difference. Even in N gauge I've indulged in a lot of compression, making features such as stations smaller than they really should be to properly represent reality and scale, and placing features much too close together for scale reality. By allowing these distortions, I've been able to construct an 8-foot by 4-foot N gauge layout having some representation of both rural and urban settings, with 4 stations and various other features, including a viaduct and a complex yard area with a turntable, engine sheds, etc. I've also broadened the focus of my N gauge modelling from my initial focus on the LMS before World War II. Whilst I still definitely feel more attachment to the LMS than to any other railway, I have, whilst staying with the period 1923 to 1939, gone on to represent operations of all of the big 4 companies, LMS, LNER, SR and GWR. So why am I now embarking on an 00 gauge layout? Did I make a mistake in my initial choice? Have my circumstances changed? Well, no and no. I still believe that all of my reasons for choosing British N gauge made sense, and I still don't have room in the house for a layout larger than tabletop proportions. What is pushing me into 00 gauge is the limitation of the range of rolling stock available in British N gauge. There are just so many things that are simply unavailable in N gauge, unless of course you feel you can build them yourself. As I've made clear, the LMS is my first love. Now it is possible to buy in N gauge representations of many of the major classes of locomotive used by the LMS and of the basic wagon and coaching stock used. But, for example, no company has ever released in N gauge a model of an LMS restaurant car, or an LMS sleeping car, or of the clerestory coaches inherited from the Midland Railway, or of an LMS travelling post office. And many of the major engine classes are unrepresented in N gauge. No Clawton, no Princess Royal, no Streamlined Coronation. And this is not to even start looking at more obscure classes of rolling stock. So I really wanted to try 00 gauge because of the tempting range of rolling stock which is available, both as recent releases and from the long history of 00 gauge railway modelling. With this in mind, I strived to clear some space in my basement where I could start working on an 00 gauge layout. This will still necessarily be a tabletop layout. And of course, an 8-foot by 4-foot layout in 00 gauge can only represent a quarter of what an 8-foot by 4-foot layout in N gauge encompasses, since 00 gauge is near as damn it to twice N gauge in linear size, which means 4 times the size in area required for the same features. So I had to think of my N gauge layout and consider what I could have done in 1/4 of the size, only 4 foot by 2 foot, rather a frightening limitation. I have seen some 00 gauge layouts that crammed considerable complexity onto an 8-foot by 4-foot board, essentially by having a veritable spaghetti of many tracks all very close to each other. I decided, at least for my initial effort, to go with simplicity, representing something along the lines of a small country station and its environs, with just one main track and some simple siding work. Now to practicalities. Getting things into my basement is a problem in itself. I simply didn't see how I could possibly carry an 8-foot by 4-foot sheet of anything down there, so I had to work around that limitation. Rather than doing carpentry from scratch, I elected to base the layout upon an 8-foot folding table. This folded in half so that it was about 4 foot by 30 inches when folded, and it weighed about 40 pounds. Even getting this down into the basement was something of a struggle. Once there, I unfolded it and set it up in the space that I had cleared. It appeared very solid and stable, with a thick plastic composite top and metal legs. I used Kato Unitrack for my N-gauge layout and was very happy with it. Kato do also make Unitrack in HO gauge, however the range of items they produce is much smaller than for N-gauge. I decided to try Bachmann's Easy Track since it seemed easier to get a range of items in HO gauge, whilst having some of the same advantages as Unitrack. I am still none too sure that this was a wise decision. Here you can see some of my initial purchases on the folding table itself. I picked up the Bachmann First Track Pack as it seemed to offer most of the track needed for the kind of layout I had in mind at a fairly reasonable price. Next to the track pack are a controller I picked up locally, some brackets I got for mounting backing boards, and the first 00 train pack I bought on eBay UK, an LMS mail train with a TPO coach and the Duchess of Abercorn loco. The table had the length I wanted, but was obviously too narrow at only around 30 inches, so I expanded the top using 3/4 inch plywood. I bought an 8-foot by 4-foot sheet from a local lumber yard and had them cut it into 4 4-foot by 2-foot strips so I could carry it around and into the basement. I wanted to surround the layout on 3 sides with a backing scene to give it a better look and to hide the basement clutter. I wanted to make the mounting of the backing scene firm but also removable, to allow for ongoing access to the layout. So I attached brackets for mounting the backing scene to the plywood for the board before gluing that down. I used 3-inch by 7-inch L brackets sold for mounting shelves. I figured that with the 3-inch side screwed firmly down to the plywood, the 7-inch side sticking up should be enough to provide good support for the backing scene. I put 2 brackets on the boards for each end. These were positioned so that they would stick up one on either side of the underlying tabletop, and of course so they would go on either side of the tabletop so the plywood could still lie flat down on the tabletop to be stuck down. I also put 1 bracket in the centre of the back of each sheet of plywood, making 4 brackets across the back of the layout. These brackets were set back 1/2 inch from the edge of the plywood to allow for the thickness of the board supporting the backing scene. I used a piece of pink insulation foam board to check this, as this was what I planned to use to mount the backing scene on. On top of the plywood, I used 1-inch sheets of white insulating foam sold for insulating garage doors. These sheets were 16 inches by 54 inches, so 6 of them placed across the board made a surface 8 foot by 4 foot 6 inches. Here you can see everything test fitted, although nothing was actually glued down at this point. Of course the white foam sticks out 6 inches from the plywood at the front, but I thought that I should be able to get away with that and the extra space on the board would be useful. Here you can see the overhang in close-up at the corner of the board. You can see the plywood underneath and the 1-inch foam on top, and behind the plywood you can see the actual table at the bottom. Since the supports for the backing scene came from 2 sheets of 8 foot by 2 foot pink foam board cut in half, which they did for me at Home Depot, the end pieces were a little shorter than the white foam base, which is 4 foot 6 inches. I later glued on additional pieces of foam board that I had left over from another project to extend the end pieces out to the same length as the white foam. At this point I received another 00 rolling stock set that I had bought on eBay. This was Bachmann's Midland Marvel set, sold in this case as in nearly new condition but without the track that the set originally came with. I picked this set up as the price was right and it seemed to fit right into my intended prototype. I had decided to stick entirely with the LMS for this initial foray into 00 gauge, and this set included an ex-Midland Fowler 3F tender loco with 2 8-plank private owner wagons and an LMS brake van, all apparently nicely modelled. The picture of the brake van included in the eBay listing did show some slight damage. The running board appeared bent and detached at one end. When I received the van, I found the damage was actually not as bad as I thought it might have been. The running board was detached from its mounting bracket at one end, but there was no permanent bend in the board itself, though the bracket was a little bent out of proper position. This was my first significant repair of an 00 gauge item. I used a drop of super glue on the tip of a toothpick to glue the board back to the bracket after gently bending the bracket back into place with tweezers. Unfortunately, even with a tiny drop of glue on the tip of a toothpick, I still left unwanted glue marks. So I did my best to cover the glue marks up by repainting. First with some blended brown on the board, and then with some flat black on the bracket. Not a perfect repair, but it will pass muster. In fact, if I weathered the van, you probably wouldn't see the repair at all. Here's the van back with its set for the time being. Back to the board construction. I cut pieces of thin foam board to go in the corners of the backing scene mounting to try to avoid having right-angled joins in the backing scene. I bought a new set of foam cutting tools, an economy buy on Amazon. I figured they'd have to do a better job than the old hot knife I've been using for some time to cut foam. The new wire cutter got red hot almost as soon as it was turned on. Is it supposed to do that? It went through the foam just as if it wasn't there, so it was certainly possible to make a clean cut with it, so long as you didn't hesitate or wobble. I used the new cutter to cut mounting braces for the corner pieces of the backing scene mount from old scrap foam board. I cut 6 braces, 3 for each corner piece. The braces were then stuck onto the corner pieces, using foam-to-foam glue. Then I used the new cutter to cut out the back corners of the white baseboard foam to allow the corner pieces to recess in. In the back corner here you can see the corner piece which is attached to the backboard by the braces. This picture was actually taken whilst I was gluing down the board, first the plywood to the table, then the white foam to the plywood. I used Gorilla construction adhesive for this, as I saw reviews that showed this as working best for gluing foam in terms of curing and adhesion. The items on the top are for weight, and I added other things on top of those afterwards to hold everything down firmly while it cured for 24 hours. Here you can see the other corner piece and also the extension piece on the end board. This is the far end. There's actually a bit missing from the extension piece to the backing board at this end, as I was using leftover board that I had on hand, but that shouldn't matter once the backing scene itself is stuck onto these boards, assuming I can manage to do that properly. Once things cured, I sprayed a coat of Krylon Craft foam primer onto the baseboard. I'm not too sure how much good this did, but it shouldn't do any harm, and hopefully would protect the base foam a bit. Some of the primer got onto the backing boards, but their only purpose is to serve as mounts for the backing scene. The next step was to lay track, not permanently yet, but at least to try out the fit of the layout I intended, and then to mark the board based on intended track and building positions, so that I would be ready to start on landscaping. Here's some of the easy track pulled out of its foam. The points all allow for remote control, which was a feature I wanted. The small rectangular black things at left are the control switches for the points. The bag at left contains extension wires to allow for connecting the power to the track and the controls to the points. I started by stacking the track pieces by type. I had made a layout design based on the one suggested with the track pack, but extended and modified a bit. You can see my printout here with the track ready to guide me in my initial setup. This is the track plan that came with the set. It was printed on the back of the box, and there was also a DVD showing in some detail how to build a version of the layout. It was pretty good. It had useful instructive stuff, although it was very much representing a later US prototype, so not appropriate to me in its details. This was my modification of the track plan. I added some additional straights and expanded things a bit to take advantage of the extra 6 inches of width on my board. I also moved around the proposed position of buildings and roads somewhat. The darker green portions are where I intend to build up the level somewhat. I intend to have a country station and a cattle dock with a goods shed and perhaps an engine shed on the sidings. In the village crossroads portion, I intend to have a village church and churchyard and a vicarage, plus a few other buildings. I got the initial track placed down and was able to fit my proposed layout on the board, although it did come right to the edge in a couple of places. Then I wanted to hook up power to test things, but I ran into some problems at this point. I bought this Troller controller used from a local store. I wasn't familiar with this type and didn't know how to connect it to the tracks. It seemed to need some kind of special plug and didn't come with any cables. I spoke to Scotty at Tiny Railroads where I bought the controller, and he suggested just using the kind of 1/4-inch connectors that are used in some kinds of wiring for lighting, etc. I went and picked some of these up from a hardware store and attached them to the ends of the Bachmann connecting wires after cutting off Bachmann's plug, which was of course designed for a Bachmann controller and not at all the same as what this controller needed. I was able to get some result this way, but alas not a really useful result. Apparently the controller was defective, since as soon as it was turned on, if there was a loco on the tracks, the loco just ran away at full speed regardless of the position of the throttle knob, and twiddling the throttle knob made absolutely no difference at all. The only way to stop the engine was to completely turn off the controller again, so that really wasn't much use. I called Scotty and he said to come down and we'd sort something out. So I had another drive down to Delhi, Ontario, about 45 kilometres from where I live. I ended up getting this Tech 3 9500 controller. This was actually the controller Scotty had been using with his demo track in the store. It was a bit more expensive than the Troller, but really a much nicer controller anyway. Apart from the fact that this one actually worked and the Troller didn't. So, finally, to conclude this first episode on my 00 gauge project, a little running video of my very first tests with the Tech 3 controller and my tentatively laid down track. So here we've got the 3F from the Midland Marvel set on the track, and we're just going to try and take it slowly round the outer loop here. The chords laid across the baseboard show where the underlying table is. They're stretched across from the brackets because I wanted to keep track of where the table was underneath the plywood and the foam board. So there's the 3F. I had some trouble with this 3F originally. Actually, it kept derailing every time it hit a point when I first got it. I ended up removing the brake connectors, which you can see just above the track in the front middle there, and it still kept derailing. It turned out the problem was one of the wires representing the sanding tubes was bent a little too far down, and whenever it went over it was okay on the straight track, but whenever it went over a point or whatever, that wire was catching and derailing it. So I had to, once I bent that wire up, then it goes round okay without having any problems derailing. But it did take a bit of fiddling around with it to get it to go round without derailing as it came to me. Always something. And this is the Webb coal tank, which I bought brand new from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario. It's on the back there. It's on the track at the back there. And I've now got the points set to go around the other part of the track, the passing siding at the end and down into the other sidings. I was disappointed to find, when I tried this out, that the easy track points are not switching. Unlike the Kato points, they don't switch the electric power. With Kato points, when you switch the electric power, when you switch the point, the power only goes down in the direction that the point is set to turn the traffic. The other track will be unpowered with a Kato point, whereas apparently these easy track points pass power all the time to all tracks, so all tracks are powered all the time. So I'm going to have to muck around with insulators, separating things out and turning off sections if I want to be able to park trains in sidings and things. I was just buying some stuff today for that.